So here to talk about this dramatic debt ceiling debate in the Senate last night is Dick Morris. Dick, good to have you back with us.
Good. Well, it's good to be here.
All right, always good reporting from Mr. Raju and Mr. Burgess about
Right.
the inner workings of the Senate chamber. What was your take on the way things went down?
The Senate was a bit chaotic because the Democrats control it, so it was hard for the Republicans to orchestrate it. The really phony thing, the really fraudulent thing, was what happened in the House. Boehner went to his caucus and said, hey guys, let's approve the debt limit in return for pretty good spending cuts or other restorations. And the House Republicans said, or enough of them said, we're not going to vote for a debt limit increase under any circumstances. You could balance the whole budget and we're not going to go for it. So he didn't have his 218 votes to pass it because he couldn't get any Democratic votes if there were cuts. So then he basically said, okay, I'm going to get as many of my people as I can and get some Democrats over. And his people, the Republicans, came to him and said, please, pass it with Democratic votes. Just apply the 20 or 30 votes of your leadership team to the Democratic votes and pass it and let all of us vote against it. So that was the deal. So all of these Republican congressmen can now go to their primary opponents from the Tea Party and say, hey, I voted against raising the debt limit, knowing darn well
and that's the House, but we're
that
talking
they were willing to vote for it if they needed it. And it's the same dynamic in the Senate.
Well, let's talk about the two guys who are going to have to talk about this, I guess, the most, and that's Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. This wasn't easy for him to do, but on the on the flip side of this, he was in a very tough spot. And you talked about how the rank and file members kind of chew up and spit out the Speaker of the House. Is it the same thing in the Senate? Is this the same similar situation?
The majority leader has less control in the Senate. McConnell is ahead of Bevin, his challenger in the primary. So he probably figures that he can skate through the primary. And his problem is the general. And he didn't, against Grimes, I think is her name.
Right.
And he didn't want to have a government shutdown or a bill stalling in the Senate because of him when he had a general election that was tough. But in his mind, the villain is Ted Cruz. The Democrats were perfectly prepared to pass this and let all the Republicans vote against it. I think that the American people get more and more sophisticated as each of these things happen. And I think they realize the debt limit is now just a political football. In 2011, right after the Tea Party controlled the House, it became very good because we got $1 trillion of cuts. But everybody was so scared by the abortive October shutdown that they're not willing to do it again.
Yeah,
and I think everybody realizes the debt limit is just a symbolic fight that doesn't mean anything anymore.
And the more we talk about it, the less it means, in effect. Let's also talk a little bit about President Obama and his response. Of course, it's, I guess, impossible for guys like President Obama or Harry Reid to not take a little victory lap in situations like this. Here's what the president had to say. I'm reading a quote here from him. I'm pleased that Republicans and Democrats in Congress have come together to pay for what they've already spent and remove the threat of default from our economy once and for all. That was Obama yesterday. This puts an end to politics by brinksmanship. Not so subtle dig there by the president.
Sure. But bear in mind, raising the debt limit is unpopular in the United States.
Right.
Borrowing more money without cutting the budget is unpopular.
But the president does have a point. I mean, the Appropriations Committee in Congress has already signed off on these expenditures, and the bill has now come due.
Well, that's nonsense. They signed off on it when they had a 60-vote majority and could spend any amount of money they wanted. And the whole point of this is to force cuts by Congress. This is not something where you ate the soup already. We're talking about stuff where you're ordering soup for tomorrow, and you want to cut back on the order because your credit card is maxed out.
We'll go into that a little bit because that is the most common defense we hear from, or we've heard from the president or from Harry Reid or from Nancy Pelosi every time the debt ceiling comes up, that Congress is already committed to these expenditures.
Congress isn't committed to anything that they don't appropriate. And Congress has, in the past, made these appropriations and authorizations for the future. But each year, Congress has to pass an appropriation measure or a continuing resolution carrying over the last one to spend the money.
Right.
So the mere fact that we spent $100 million on widgets in 2013 doesn't mean we have to spend it in 2014. The debt limit is not about borrowing the money for 13. We've already done that. It's about borrowing the money for 14 and 15 and 16. We haven't done that yet. So it's fully appropriate to make cuts in those out years because it's not a question of the bills coming due. All that's coming due is your intention to buy it. Honey, I'm going to buy a color TV next week, a plasma TV next week. Oh dear, we can't afford it. We're maxed out on our credit card. Okay, we'll do without it. That's what the House is saying, the Republicans are saying.
So this is not a case of, hey, we've already committed to paying these military members or these
okay, let's
policemen.
amend that conversation.
Yeah.
Honey, I'd like to buy a plasma TV. Okay, you sure it's okay with you? Yeah. Then next week, honey, we're maxed out on our credit card. We better cancel that plasma TV. Okay, let's cancel it.
All right, fair enough. Let's move on. We referenced this in the headlines, and this is not a repeat show here. This is actually happening. Another Obamacare delay this week. Also, the president said he was doing it to be flexible and helping out businesses adjusting to the new law. But now it appears that there are some even newer, trickier rules. Obama officials said businesses will be required to certify to the IRS under penalty of law that Obamacare was not a motivating factor. To avoid Obamacare costs, business owners must swear that they are not trying to avoid Obamacare costs. Dick,
you know what the oath
it sounds
should
like a loyalty pledge.
Should sound like this. Federal government, I'm the owner of a business. I employ 100 employees. I had the option of hiring another 10 employees, and I said no. And in fact, I fired one of my employees. The fact that it got to 99 workers was absolutely irrelevant. The Obamacare had nothing to do with it. I didn't consider costs in any of these business decisions. Now, what businessman in his right mind does not consider the costs of his action? You know what your payroll cost is. Health premiums and fines for Obamacare are part of that. A businessman literally under this has to swear that the cost of his payroll was a totally irrelevant factor in whether to hire or fire people or shift them to part-time. It's ridiculous. Only a community organizer could possibly think that a guy could operate a business or a woman could operate a business without asking what the costs are.
I mean, you know, we're starting to learn about all these pages in the law now, and these, you know, how does this stuff even get in there? That's
well,
really
it's not in there. Nancy Pelosi said you have to pass the bill to know what's in it. She was wrong. You have to let Obama interpret it as he wishes. There are 16, some say 37, executive orders that have come down, none of which is sanctioned by the law, all of which are imposed by Obama because he didn't like the law that he wrote and he had Congress pass.
Well, let's keep talking about this because there's another issue. We heard so much about, remember the Medicare Part D, the so-called donut hole, but there's another huge group of Americans who are falling through the cracks, and that's our folks who are working Americans. They make a little bit too much money to qualify for subsidies for Obamacare, but also are, you know, they're too rich to qualify for the subsidies, also too rich to qualify for Medicaid as well. 5 million people here, Dick. What, you know, again, millions of people affected adversely by this.
What happened was that when they passed Obamacare, they figured that Medicaid would go up to 133% of the poverty level. That's about $15,000 for a single individual. Then they figured Obamacare would pick up where Medicaid left off. Then the Supreme Court came along and said you don't have to raise it to 133%. It's up to each state. And 25 states said, okay, we'll raise it up to 133. But 25 said, no, we won't. For those 25, their Medicaid eligibility is back at 100% of the poverty level or even less.
Because they don't want to be exposed to the additional costs.
To what they're going to have to pay.
All right.
And that creates a gap between their Medicaid coverage and the kick-in of the subsidy. And 5 million people are falling through that gap.
Well, the folks watching the show are just going to have to bear with us as we kind of work through these daily problems that arise with Obamacare. But Dick, thanks for kind of explaining them for us. We'll be back with you in a moment after the break. But first, we want to hear from you, of course. What do you think about the results of the debt ceiling debate? Did the grassroots and Tea Party groups win or lose? Does this deal mean yet another blow and for the re-election aspirations of Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell? We want to hear from you. Our contact information is up here on the screen. Tweet us, email us, Facebook us. We want to hear from you. Also, when we come right back, Dick Morris, again, will be here with us to talk about the massive purchase of ammo by the Department of Homeland Security, plus these new Metropolitan ID cards that New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio wants to implement in his new version of New York City. We'll be right back after this.